Okay, so this is the last lecture we're going to be doing on being and nothingness. And what I want to do today is work through Sartre's account of freedom in relation to what we might say were the sort of natural limitations on our freedom. Now, we've seen all the way through that Sartre thinks that we're condemned to be free. But nonetheless, we're clearly surrounded by aspects of the world that limit our freedom in a whole series of different ways. You know, we're born in a particular place, that we are necessarily going to die, we're surrounded by other people who have different projects than our own. So it's important for Sartre to answer the question of how these elements of our facticity are going to affect our freedom. Now, the heart of Sartre's account here is the claim that the in itself and the for itself both condition each other. So there's a reciprocal conditioning. So through our projects, we give meaning to the world. But this in turn structures the nature of the world itself. So if you're a skier, for instance, looking at a snow-covered mountainside, you're going to see in that surface the kind of the natural lines that the skier could take while traversing it. Whereas, for instance, me, who's not a skier, would see just an undifferentiated plane of snow, and what for the skier might be a practical field of engagement, for me might be seen as an aesthetic object. So depending on our projects, how the world itself is determined is going to change. So the world constrains our actions, but what those constraints entail is going to depend on what our projects and our aims in terms of the world themselves are. Okay. So what I want to do today is begin by looking at the opening sections, the opening parts of this section, where Sartre sets out more clearly his account of freedom and deals with some of the common objections that we might raise to it. And then I want to work through the 5 moments of facticity that Sartre considers in this chapter. So those are my place, the past, my environment, my neighbour or my fellow man, depending on the translation, and my death. Okay. So we'll look at those 5 moments, and then at the end I'll summarise some of what Sartre says in terms of the significance of these different moments of facticity in terms of our freedom and our projects. Okay. So before turning to the specific claims that Sartre makes about the moments of our freedom, well, let's take a quick look at the relation of freedom to facticity more generally. Now, Sartre begins by noting that there's what he calls a coefficient of adversity attached to facticity. Now, all that means is that when we try and act in the world, our projects are made more difficult by features of the world itself. So if we try and climb a mountain, for instance, there's the chance that that project of climbing the mountain might be thwarted by the nature of the mountain itself. So Sartre's claim throughout this section is that what appears to be a limit to freedom, in fact, always presupposes a prior moment of freedom itself. So you can see that in the case of the mountain. You know, the only reason why a mountain appears to be unclimbable is because we previously categorise it as an object to be climbed. And that's only one of the various different attitudes that we could take towards it. So we can therefore note that freedom to adopt a project is also not going to involve, because of this coefficient of adversity, a claim about whether or not that project is going to be successful. So we're free, but we're not free to succeed in whatever project we take up. The world is going to push back against those projects. But the freedom, in a sense, comes from deciding the projects we're going to take on and thereby determining the kind of significances we're going to find in the world. Okay, so second point, the coefficient of adversity is a necessary aspect of us acting in accordance with our freedom. So if the world didn't push back against our projects, then there would be no difference between conceiving of something or wishing for it and making a decision to commit to a project. So it's only because it takes time and requires us to engage in a world that's external to us that we can make sense of the idea of a difference between a general sense of wishing something and a real engagement with a project where we try and accomplish it in fact rather than in our imaginations. Okay, now as we saw a couple of weeks ago, being for itself or consciousness is not its own foundation, since it's essentially an upsurge in the heart of being in itself. Now that means that being for itself is contingent, because for it not to be contingent would mean that it had its own foundation, or rather it was its own foundation. Now in emerging into being for itself also organises the world. Now for Sartre, for something to appear determinate, that is, for something to be the kind of thing that we can say things about and we can question and qualify, we need the notion of negation. So there's some similarities with Hegel here. Prior to being for itself's emergence into the world therefore is really just a plenitude of matter, because without consciousness to introduce this moment of negation into the world, there's no determination. It's just an undifferentiated mass of stuff. So we can't even talk about it at all. Now what that means is, although the world and consciousness are contingent, there's a necessary relationship between the two of them, whereby consciousness introduces negation into being, and it's this introduction of negation into being that allows being to become determinate, and therefore to become an object that consciousness can exist in relation to. So consciousness and the world are both contingent beings, but in a sense, given the existence of consciousness, there's a necessary relation to the world. And given the existence of the world, it has a necessary relationship to consciousness. Now, as I say, if we can even speak of being in itself prior to consciousness, it's pure plenitude without any determinations, because the determinations only come from consciousness. What allows it to become determinate, therefore, is the fact that we relate to the world, and we relate to it in terms of a project that isn't present. A project that is an aim to change the world in some way, and it's related to a future state that isn't yet the case. So what that means is that our projects introduce negation into the world, and in introducing negation into the world, they allow the world to be determined. So it's us that makes the world a determined entity. And how do we do that? We do that by introducing nothingness into the world. What's that nothingness? Well, it's the projects that we want to accomplish within the world. Okay. And obviously, to come back to freedom, those projects are free choices on our part, how we want to conceive of the world. Now, Sartre calls this concept of a world that's organised according to our projects our situation. So the situation is something which is essentially a fusion of our freedom with the world in which that freedom expresses itself. And Sartre defines it as follows. He says, we shall use the term situation for the contingency of freedom in the plenum of being of the world, inasmuch as this datum, which is there only in order not to constrain freedom, is revealed to this freedom only as already illuminated by the end which freedom chooses. Thus, the datum never appears to the for itself as a brute existent in itself. It is discovered always as a cause, since it is revealed only in the light of an end which illuminates it. Situation and motivation are really one. The for itself discovers itself as engaged in being, hemmed in by being, threatened by being. It discovers the state of things which surround it as the cause for a reaction of defence or attack. But it can make this discovery only because it freely posits the end in relation to which the state of things is threatening or favourable. Okay, so we never encounter brute being. We always encounter a being that has values and pushes and pulls within it. And that's because we encounter it already qualified by our fundamental projects. So what I want to do for the rest of the lecture really is work through the 5 aspects of the situation that Sartre highlights in his discussion. So these are place, past, environment, my fellow man, and my death. Okay, so we'll just go through each of these in turn, and then at the end I'll summarise the general points he's making. Okay, so we could say that place is something that's thoroughly determined and that provides a chain of determinations that ends in the brute fact that we're born in a particular place in the world. Now, at the heart of Sartre's analysis of place is the claim that we can't understand place in existential terms as involving objective geometrical measures. So our place isn't defined by being a certain number of miles from Paris or a certain number of miles from London. Rather, the distances that define my place are governed by the kinds of projects that I engage in. So distances are a reflection of the projected future that I aim at from my present place. Okay, so here's what Sartre says. I think this is a useful quote. To be there is to have to take just one step in order to reach the teapots, to be able to dip the pen in the ink by stretching my arm, to have to turn my back to the window if I want to read without tiring my eyes, to have to ride my bicycle and to put up with the fatigue of a hot afternoon for 2 hours if I wish to see my friend Pierre, to take the train and pass a sleepless night if I want to see Annie. For a colonial, to be there is to be 20 days from France. Better yet, if he is a civil servant and is waiting for a trip at government expense, it is to be 6 months and 7 days from Bordeaux or from Etaples. For a soldier, to be there is to be 110, 120 days from his discharge. Okay, so place isn't simply a location within the world, but it's rather somewhere where I'm building a life or somewhere I'm trying to escape from. So we're not talking here about distances. What we take to be the world itself is something that's defined by our projects. So Sartre gives the example of someone living in a small town who wishes to travel to New York. Here, the situation of the small town appears to be an impediment to their true projects. But it's also the case that the world outside of the town is one full of relations between New York, London, Paris and other cities that are conceived of as real places. Now, if you're a farmer living in that same town, whose aim is to develop his place within that community itself, all of these places outside of the immediate situation are really a kind of undifferentiated background and they're indistinguishable from each other. And that's because they don't have any meaning. So if your goal is to go to New York, then New York has a certain connotation in relation to the other great cities of the world. But if your goal is to stay in the small town, all of the big cities appear to be an undifferentiated mass. Yeah, it's irrelevant which you're talking about. Now what that means is that the significance of my place is determined by my projects. And there's no objective field of places that could be used to compare which place is a greater hindrance than any other. All places can be a hindrance to us or an aid to us, depending on what we want to achieve. Okay, my past. So the determinist understanding of our past would be to say that it's constituted by facts that together determine my future. Now, there clearly are such facts, such the fact that, when I was 4 years old, I developed whooping cough. That's an undeniable fact about my past. Now, Sartre's key move in terms of the past is essentially to argue that it's not my past that determines my present and future, but the meaning I give to my past that does so. And this opens the question of what is it that determines the significance of events in my past? And the answer for Sartre is going to be that the significance of events in my past are understood in terms of my future projects. So it's in the light of these future projects that I give significance to the things that have happened to me in my life. So here's an example he gives. He says, who shall decide whether that mystic crisis of my 15th year was a pure accident of puberty, or on the contrary, the first sign of a future conversion? I myself, according to whether I shall decide at 20 years of age, at 30 years, to be converted. The project of conversion by a single stroke confers on an adolescent crisis the value of a premonition, which I had not taken seriously. Who shall decide whether the period I spent in prison after a theft was fruitful or deplorable? I, according to whether I give up stealing or become hardened. Who can decide the educational value of a trip, the sincerity of a profession of love, the purity of a past intention, etc.? It is I, always I, according to the ends by which I illuminate these past events. Now, that doesn't mean that the meaning of the past doesn't determine our future. In fact, what's going to happen is once we've decided on our future projects, what happens in effect is that our past lines up in accordance with the projects that we've decided upon. So essentially, aspects of our past are then taken to have a great significance, while others are taken to kind of fade into the background. And that depends on the narrative of how our current occupation relates to our future project. So the past determines our present relation to the future, but only on the basis of a free decision about what our future aims are going to be. Now, just as spatial relations don't operate in geometrical terms, the way that we understand history also can't be seen as involving objective periods of time. So the way that we structure history changes as new events alter the significance of the past. Now, as an example that Sartre uses, the Great War only really becomes such with the advent of the Second World War, which in turn defines the interwar period as a time with a different significance to what it had prior to that introduction of the Second World War. So the interwar period, the meaning of it changes given the advent of the Second World War. So there's ultimately no significance, or no fixed significance, would be a better way of putting it. There's ultimately no fixed significance to history. So once again, I'll give you a quote that sets this out. So human history would have to be finished before a particular event, for example, the taking of the Bastille, could receive a definite meaning. Nobody denies, of course, that the Bastille was taken in 1789. There is an immutable fact. But are we to see in this event a revolt without consequence, a popular outburst against a half-dismantled fortress, an event which the convention, anxious to create a famous past for itself, was able to transform into a glorious deed? Or should we consider it as the first manifestation of popular strength, by which the populace asserted itself, gave itself confidence, and put itself in a position to march on Versailles? In those last days of October, he who would like to decide the question today forgets that the historian is himself historical. That is, he historicises himself by illuminating history in the light of his projects and those of his society. Thus, it's necessary to say that the meaning of the social past is perpetually in suspense. Slowly moving around the room. Okay, my environment. Now, by my environment, Sartre means the surrounding group of objects that together enable me to engage in my projects, and also that can stand in the way of them too. Now, the environment surrounding us can always manifest itself. The environment surrounding us can always manifest itself as something that supports our projects. When we go for a walk and it turns out to be sunny, like today. But it's also the case that my environment can serve to prevent me from completing my projects. So when the car breaks down, for instance. Now, the first thing to note about these kinds of cases is that, as I said earlier, freedom isn't based on the success of my projects, but rather on the ability to give significance to the world. So the fact that the world makes my project impossible doesn't affect the fact that it's a freely chosen project. So the resistance of the world to my freedom doesn't show that I'm not free. Now, there are two consequences to this. First, the fact that my environment appears to threaten my project can only be measured in terms of the project itself. If I give up on the project that I'm undertaking, it's because of a deeper and more general project that overrides it. So as Sartre says, if the clouds which cover the sky can move me to give up my project of an outing, this is because they are grasped in a free projection in which the value of the outing is bound to a certain state of the sky, which step by step refers back to the value of an outing in general, to my relation to nature, and to the place which this relation occupies in the ensemble of relations which I sustain with the world. So if it's too rainy to go for a walk, that reflects on my more general conception of how I want to orientate myself to nature. You know, whether I'm a kind of fair weather walker or whether I see my engagement with nature to transcend the particular adversities. I recognise an adversity as an inherent part of being a part of the natural world. Second, even if my project appears impossible against the environment, it's me who gives this status of impossibility to it. So he says, we've already shown that even the red-hot pincers of the torturer do not exempt us from being free. This does not mean that it's always possible to get around the difficulty, to repair the damage, but simply that the very impossibility of continuing in a certain direction must be freely constituted. So, at the heart of the idea of the environment is that while we can always encounter circumstances that derail our projects, what this really highlights is the fact that in engaging with our projects, we're engaging in a world which transcends them and hence is indifferent to our own aims. It also highlights how our projects are open and hence liable to be altered in the light of circumstances. So circumstances can't cause us to change our projects, but they can provide us with a motivation to do so. Okay. My fellow man. Now, like I say, Sartre talks about my fellow man or my neighbour, depending on the edition. But it's kind of important, I think, that the term he uses is a measure of particularity, so it's very different from the kind of the generalised other that you might find in, say, Hegel. So my fellow man or my neighbour, his account of it covers three different themes here. So the first of these is that I'm born into a system of meanings that's not my own. The second is that I use a language which pre-exists me and once again is filled with meanings that I haven't chosen. And the third is that I encounter the other directly and hence encounter my own being for others through them. Now, I'll just talk about the first and the third of these moments today. So, dealing with the first point, we're born into a world where we're surrounded by meanings that pre-exist us. So there are signs that tell us where to go, there are cultural habits that we share with others around us, there are rules of conduct like the way in which we drive on the left-hand side of the road in this country, and as such we belong to a species and to a world which transcends our own meanings. Now, this belonging to a species is characterised by Sartre in terms of relating to the world through a set of culturally specific techniques. So we're all human beings, but this humanity is always going to be cashed out in terms of the specifics of our cultural background. So to be human is to come from a particular country in a particular city, and hence to relate to the world in a specific way that's going to determine how we express that being humanness. You know, there's no being human in general, like there's no other in general. We're always expressing our being human from a particular cultural vantage point. So he says, to be French, for example, is only the truth of being a Savoyard. But to be a Savoyard is not simply to inhabit the high valleys of Savoy. It is, amongst 1,000 other things, to ski in the winters, to use the ski as a mode of transportation, and precisely it is to ski according to the French method, not that of Arlberg or of Norway. But since the mountain and the snowy slopes are apprehended only through a technique, it is precisely to discover the French meaning of the ski slopes. In fact, according to whether one will employ the Norwegian method, which is better for gentle slopes, or the French method, which is better for steep slopes, the same slope will appear as steeper or more gentle, exactly as an upgrade will appear as more or less steep to the bicyclist, according to whether he will put himself in a neutral or a low gear. Now, does this reliance on technique mean that our freedom is constrained? Well, there's a sense in which not having certain techniques means that some projects are impossible. You know, so Descartes can't have the project or can't complete the project of flying in an aeroplane because aeroplanes didn't exist. That technique's impossible. But this doesn't stop us from being free. Rather, we need to note that while we relate to the world according to techniques, we relate to the world through techniques, and it's the projects themselves, not the techniques that we use, that determine our freedom. Thus, when the for itself affirms itself in the face of the other as object, by the same stroke it reveals techniques. Consequently, it can appropriate them, that is, interiorize them. But suddenly, there are the following consequences. By employing a technique, the for itself surpasses the technique towards its own end. It is always beyond the technique it employs. 2. The technique, which was originally a pure meaningful conduct, fixed in some other as object, now, because it is interiorized, loses its character as a technique and is integrated purely and simply in the free surpassing of the given towards ends. It is recovered and sustained by a freedom which founds it exactly as dialect or speech is sustained by the free project of the sentence. Now, there's another constraint on my freedom which is caused by my fellow man, and that's the one we discussed over the last couple of weeks. So in relating to another person, I'm constituted as being for others. So I therefore take on determinations that aren't determinations of my own choosing. Now, Sartre holds here that the other is a real limit on my freedom, but nonetheless that even if the other forces a set of determinations on me, I have a choice in how I take on these determinations. Now, Sartre puts it, a Jew is not a Jew first in order to be subsequently ashamed or proud. It is his pride in being a Jew, his shame or his indifference that will reveal to him his being a Jew, and this being a Jew is nothing outside of the free manner of adopting it. So I'm given an identity by the other, but I have a choice in how to take up this identity or how to take up these determinations given to me by the other. Okay. Now the final aspect of my situation and all our situations that Sartre considers is the fact that I will die. Now, if you read Heidegger, you'll know this is a really big theme of Heidegger's early writings, where Heidegger argues that it's my death that makes me an individual to the extent that no one else can experience my death. So it leads me to a recognition of the finitude of my own life and determines my own life's meaning. The fact that it is only me who experiences my death draws me out of Das Man and makes me an individual. So for Heidegger, death functions like the final chord in the melody of life. It's the moment that brings life to a close, but also which completes life. Now for Sartre, rather than death making our life meaningful, it robs us of meaning. It's a contingent aspect of our existence and one that's ultimately tied to our being for others. So just as other people can ascribe to us characteristics that tie us to a certain mode of existing, so too after our death, the meaning of our life escapes us and becomes governed by those around us. Similarly, we can't see our lives as having the structure of a melody because we can die at any moment. And even if we live to an old age, it's possible to outlive the projects that we take up. So you can think of a young filmmaker who produces works of genius, and then the later works become dull and cliched. Sort of like Woody Allen, for instance. So, as such, the view that death forms a part of life is radically rejected by Sartre. And Sartre's claim is that what philosophers who take death as the source of meaning of life are trying to present is the idea that life is not something that's reversible, that life just goes in one direction. So when we make decisions, we change the world in a way that means that we can't return to the world prior to those decisions. Now that's not a feature that comes from our death for Sartre, but it's a fundamental feature of being free, and it would be a form of finitude that we would have even if we were immortal. So even an immortal being would live a life that was irreversible, and that's the source of the sense of meaning that Heidegger, or someone like Heidegger, finds in death. Okay. All right, well, that's it of the situation, really. The only thing I want to discuss, really to conclude, is just to give you an account of Sartre's summary of this notion of a situation that he presents at the end of the section. Now, Catalano, in turn, Joseph Catalano presents in his book a sort of summary of the summary. So I'm just going to present the 6 characteristics that Sartre draws out in the form that Catalano summarises them. Or slightly modified from Catalano, but he's a good source on this. Okay. So first of all, I arise as a consciousness in the midst of a world of adversity and instrumentality. Second, the situation is thus neither purely subjective nor purely objective. So our situation is the annihilation of a given, but at the same time it's always already run through with our own consciousness. And third, the situation is the very being of being for itself as a choice, and that choice is revealed as the in itself kind of illuminated by our own ends as for itself. Fourth, as the fundamental facticity of human reality, the situation is always concrete and always illuminated by concrete ends. So I think you'll have noticed this. It's one of the strong points, I think, of Sartre's case, or Sartre's analysis, is that everything takes place on the level of particularity. So the situation is always a particular situation here from which I operate. Situation is not composed of laws and techniques that restrain man. All laws and connections between so-called brute givens arise from the temporality and intentionality of others, and human reality projects its own freedom across these connections. Finally, man's recognisable permanence, as in a condition fundamentally similar to others, doesn't arise from any substantive permanence, but from his free engagement with his environment. So we stay the same through our processes of engagement rather than through being a particular substance. Okay, all right, well, bro, that's all I wanted to say about situation for today. Next week we'll go on and we'll look at the critique of dialectical reason very briefly, where we'll look at Sartre's account of how it's possible for the individual to form groups in order to engage in activity with others for a collective purpose.